Okay, well, let's get started. It's 6 o'clock. I'm Ann Wert. I'm so happy to have you all here. Thanks for joining me on a Wednesday night. Thank goodness we have air conditioning. This is going to be, I'm going to walk you through how I approach a watercolor painting. I'm going to show you a bunch of things. I'm going to do a little bit of a demo and then give you some things to think about with your own watercolor painting. And if I were to name this, I would call my watercolor approach as planning and playing. So I had been an oil painter for a long time, and I found that through that process, I just always wanted to start painting. And in watercolor, it doesn't work as well in a satisfying way if you do that. And so what I've done now is take all of the decisions and all of the thinking that any artist does in any making, and I put it at the front of my watercolor painting. I do all the planning and the thinking and the composition and the value and all of the color choices. I think about all of that before I start my painting. Sometimes it could be as much as 80% of the painting, and then by the time I sit down with my brush, I have 20% left to do. Sometimes it's maybe 50-50. And the reason I sort of really had to categorize things like this for me is because I was finding it was so frustrating. I wanted to have a painting session and I couldn't get painting. I was doing all these other things. I was deciding on my composition and doing a little value study and figuring out my colors and what technique. And then 3 hours would go by and I hadn't even painted yet. And all of a sudden I realized I've been painting the whole time. And that for any artist, the painting, the art making starts much earlier than I was allowing myself to get credit for. And so this is my way of feeling good that I've spent a lot of time making the art I want to make, even if I don't get to the what I call the play part until much later. So I've now come to find it to be quite satisfying, and I'm enjoying all these other pieces of it. So I'm hoping some of this will connect with you. Maybe you already use all of these steps in your process. And if not, if you don't learn something from me, hopefully you learn something from each other, or more importantly, just from yourself in the doing of it. So what I wanted to start with was the way I think about things. So I have a few images here. I was lucky enough to take a trip to South Carolina a couple years ago, and I was walking on the beach and I just took a bunch of photos, and it was so brightly sunny I couldn't even tell what I was taking. I think I was capturing some good images, and so I've had these images floating around wanting to paint them. I've painted some of them here and there. So today, thinking about this, this is what I'll do. I'll sit with all my photos and figure out what I'm going to paint. And figuring out what you're going to paint is the first and the most important step of your painting. If you if you mess up that, meaning what am I going to paint? If you start with a bad reference or you start with something you're not excited about, trying to make a good painting is going to be difficult. So I've narrowed it down to 2 after looking through this. And the way I narrow it down to these 2, and I'll turn these around and show you, these are the 2 I've narrowed it down to. And I'm going to show you how I then narrow it down to 1. And I got to this point by thinking about composition. And so all of these images have the same general composition, but there's a couple things about these 2 that's more appealing to me. And so when I'm thinking about composition, I'm thinking about the rule of thirds. I'm thinking about leading your eye through the painting. When I think about composition, I'm thinking about what is going to keep a viewer looking at my painting for as long as possible. And the way I work this out is through doing some thumbnail sketches. So I tie some of this planning process together. So I have both of these, and I'm just going to show you some of my thumbnail sketches that I've done before, and then bless you, and then I'll do them here. So this is, you can't even see it, I know, but this, I was working on these are 4 little tiny compositions of a farmhouse. And I was just playing around with composition. Where do they go? And this probably spent 20 minutes. And I do them tiny because I don't want to lose my energy or my excitement for the subject matter. Here I have a farmhouse drawn 2 different times. This is a square composition. And you can see one is just in pencil and one I've done a value study of. The one that has the value study is the one that I ultimately chose to paint. And so this is why they're often tied together in my mind, is that I will do 2 or 3, sometimes 4 thumbnail sketches. I want to decide if it's vertical, if it's horizontal, if it's going to be square. And then I'll do a value study of the one that I think is the most exciting. Sometimes it looks like this, where I really need to do the value study to find out what's most exciting. So here I have two that are horizontal, one that's square and one that's vertical, and I still couldn't decide. So I did value studies for all of them. Do I want all of a background? Do I want a dark foreground and light background, just working it all out. And I have pages and pages and pages of this. And you saw this, those of you, this was the one that I did in the demo. And the reason I think this is really important, I don't want this out here just yet. Again, I do this over and over and over again. This is waiting for my car to get serviced, just sitting in a little, in the waiting room. Sometimes the value study is just as beautiful as the painting. I love this value study. I ended up selling this painting years ago, but I still really enjoy looking at the value study. So, and sometimes I don't want to be bothered with thinking about all those values. When I'm talking about value, I'm thinking about, I don't always do this, but this is a good thing to do if you haven't done it. If you haven't done it in a while, this is a great thing to do in watercolor. The thickness of the paint and the amount of water in watercolor correspond directly to value. So this is ultramarine blue. Probably for most of you, you think this is ultramarine blue, but this is also ultramarine blue. And so knowing what your colors can do is really important. And I'm about to tell you, if you haven't figured it out yet, why this is so important in watercolor. This is just a no-tan. So this is a term where you're just using lights and darks. And this is also a really great idea if you don't have the patience to perhaps go through an entire value study. A no-tan can be really helpful because it just shows you shapes and it connects shapes, and it really can be very helpful for composition. So if you go through this process of thumbnails and value studies, it can ultimately help you decide what to paint. And so I like to do this process, and I sometimes will do the drawing and the thumbnails. Very often I do that. But if I'm out painting, or if I am in a hurry, or I have a workshop where people need to see things a little bigger, I will just use my phone. So this is just, I turned those two images into black and white and just printed them on my black and white printer. And once I've done this, for me, it becomes very clear which one I want to paint. There's not a right answer, but for me, it's clear which one I feel like painting. So this whole process of going through composition and value, to me, is essential. So this is the one that's more intriguing to me. And you might disagree. There's no right or wrong answer. But this is the one I'm more intrigued by when I start thinking about value. And so when I look at this, this is an intriguing thing for me to paint. When I think about value, for me, it's less intriguing. It doesn't look quite as interesting. There's not as much movement. And the reason I like this one is because I'm really picking up on this little S curve that's sort of leading your eye through the painting. And that's really interesting to me. I'm big into diagonals. The other thing why this is really effective compositionally is the rule of thirds, meaning if you divide your painting vertically and horizontally into thirds, wherever those points intersect is a strong compositional point. So right here, right about where this house is an intersection of thirds, and that's really interesting. You could also argue that maybe this dune down here is another interesting point of the painting, or a high contrast. That's also at an intersection of thirds. So this is the composition I'm going to go with, and the value study I'm going to go with. And so that's all well and good. I'm trying to decide if I think I'm just going to do that real quick for you. So I'm going to just do a quick little value study and show you what that looks like, and then I'm going to talk about color. So now I've chosen my image, I've worked out the composition, and thought through value. So why am I thinking about value? Why is value important? If you take a look at your watercolor clock that's near all of your, I think everyone got one of those. This is not my invention, but Joseph Zbuvik says it so beautifully. It's his book down there, Mastering Atmosphere and Mood in Watercolor, is a fabulous one. It's out of print, but if you find it, grab it. And if you'll notice, we'll talk about the left side of the paper in a minute, but on the right side of the paper, he's talking about how the thickness of the paint corresponds to the value. So just like I pointed out before with the ultramarine blue, he breaks it down a little bit more simply. So he talks about a tea wash. This is also ultramarine. This is cobalt, actually. A tea wash, a coffee wash, milk, cream, and butter. And those are talking about the consistency of the paint, not the colors themselves. So the reason I want to do this, and why I feel like a value study is so important, especially in watercolor, is because watercolor is the most forgiving and the most enjoyable, and you can play the most if you work light to dark. So knowing where your lights are is extremely important. And a value study can be very, very helpful on, one, helping you work out the composition. I've already decided the composition, but just in my little doodlings here, I might discover some pitfalls. And work out the composition, and then also work out the values and give you the roadmap for what to do when. And in watercolor, it's all about timing. And so knowing what to paint when can be sometimes intimidating and sometimes confusing. And so if you have this roadmap of value, it really shows you what to do and when. And I often refer back to my value study if I've forgotten what I'm doing. I know you can't see what I'm doing. I did a very simple, tiny little value study. One thing to point out, and I ran into it earlier today in prepping for this, your little tiny thumbnail, and I'm going to really encourage you all to do this today, even if you've already gotten farther ahead in the planning process, needs to be in proportion to your large sheet of paper that you're going to paint on, because it doesn't do you any good if you do a thumbnail that's a square and you have a horizontal, or if you have a vertical thumbnail and your page is a square, so you really want to make sure that's the same. And the way I work this is just with one color. I usually choose a blue, and this also helps me with the left side of the paper now. So I'm going to get a little preview of the drying time in this room. And so if you combined how much paint and how much water with how wet or dry your paper is, that's everything. That's watercolor. That's it. Just combining how much paint and water with how dry or wet your paper is, and you can get every single thing in watercolor. So the trick is that how quickly things dry is not constant. It completely depends on the day, the time, the room. It depends on where I'm standing versus where you all are sitting back there, where the airflow is. And so doing a little value study can really start to show you and help you understand the drying time. So even though I said I normally work light to dark, I'm going to go dark to light, and just for speed's sake. So here's my palette, and I just have some ultramarine blue, and I'm mixing this up thinking about our value here. I'm mixing it up to a milky consistency, the mid value. And that's where I usually like to start all of my little paint puddles. That's where I start, because then I can quickly jump in with a little bit more water and lighten it up, or I can add a little bit more pigment and get it nice and dark really fast. So I'll just, do this one real quick and let that dry, and I'll talk about color, which is the next thing I do. So here I'm thinking about where am I, and I'm trying in the value study to simplify. I'm trying to connect as many shapes as possible because I'm doing this so small. Sometimes I do it large, but usually I'm doing it small so that I can preserve time, and also I don't want to lose interest in the subject matter before I've painted the subject. So I know myself too well that I know that if I spend too much time doing this, that I will be satiated and I will want to move on to something else. So I'll turn this around and show you. I know it's hard to see, but I just want to show you too just how quickly and how simple it can be. And this is really for me. This is for me to figure out what's the lightest light here. And there are moments on that house in the background that have some highlights, and so I have to decide if I want to leave the white paper anywhere. This is when I decide that. It's too late to decide that once I've started my painting, because I might not have put the whites in the right place, or maybe I've done a wash in 2 seconds and it's gone. And so this is when I'm thinking through, where do I want to leave white paper? I'm starting to think order of operations. So when I look at this, I'm thinking probably I do want to leave some little white bits on that distant house. The sand is very light. I don't want to leave it white. It's too much of the composition to leave white. That would not be that fun to paint. So starting to make the transition to think about color. And then I'm also looking at the water. There's a tiny strip of water, and is the water lighter or darker than the sky? Those distant buildings, where do they fall? and then the shadows of the dunes and all of that. So I'm thinking about all of this as I'm painting this, even though it's 2 inches by 3 inches barely. And I'll turn this around and show you just a sec. So I know, again, you won't be able to see it very well, but sometimes that's all I need, because this is just for me. This is for me to figure out the drying time in this room. This is for me to figure out, to be in the painting. I've already like stepped inside and done a little exploration in this painting before I get to the actual work. I'm going to set that to the side. I can tweak it more. I can let it dry. It's all very wet. You know, I might want to add some darker moments as it dries, but I have enough information for now. So the next thing I want to think about, is color. And I have a few more images here I'm going to show you where I start to do that same idea of working out composition. And here's an example of a long vertical, a square. What does it have a background? Does it have no background? And I do that even for something as simple as a still life. Here I'm working out a pear. Pears are deceptively hard to draw and paint. I thought it would be an easy thing, and look, I have a whole front and back. This I find is essential. This was a commission. I was working out sky and horizon line and vertical versus horizontal. I find all of the steps I'm going to talk about tonight are essential to do on your good watercolor paper. It's very tempting to do them in your sketchbook, but this step of figuring out the drying time in the room and just seeing the way that, I mean, you could do it in your sketchbook, but I try to use my good paper whenever possible. And you can see I make good use of my paper. You know, I'm using fronts and backs, and I'm conscious that paper's not free, and so I'm trying to do all I can to that. I forgot I had put some of these slides in here. This was, I was lucky enough to do some study abroad as a younger person, and this is a photograph I took that I found. This is from, I don't know when it's from. This is something obviously I wanted to paint, but this photograph is not a good painting. This has compositionally this huge big building here, which would just be a really difficult thing to make work in a painting. So this is an example. Someone says, oh, I want to paint this. And I say, great, let's do some cropping, right? So the way I've cropped this is to make it a square. And this is the value study I've done of this reference photo. And so I've completely cropped out this building, and I'm just turned all of this into a square. And I was really captivated by atmospheric perspective and also the little zigzags that the farmland is making. So that was my value study for this photo. And then I had to work out color. So here are 2 color studies for that same image. Obviously different sizes. They're both squared up. Just working out a little bit different. It's not so dramatically different, but it's a little bit different. And they have different feelings and different moods and different vibe, I suppose. And before I get into that, I'll show you a few more examples of why color is important and something worth spending time on. These are 2 I just did recently. So even though I mostly do landscapes, I had some little flowers I was playing around with, and different colors, different feelings. Maybe they're not quite finished, but you can already see they're just different paintings, and you might like one more than the other. I kind of like this one, but this one I could maybe work on a little bit more. You might have a preference, but it makes a difference what colors you're using. And then here again, working out, this is the exact same photo reference. Actually, I did this painting originally plein air, and I was captivated by it. I've since done like 4 paintings of this little mint house. Really different colors, different compositions, totally different. So one photo can be a dozen paintings or more, and it just depends. And it goes back to that very first question, is what are you going to paint? Oh, I'm going to paint this beach scene. Okay, but why? And that is a really hard question to answer, but a really important one, because if you answer that question, then in addition to your value study as your guide, answering that question can be what helps you make all your decisions. So I already answered it for you about the S-curve. I really like the way that the S-curve of these dunes going back to that land, or the houses in that land. That's what I want to capture. So I might have to remove some things, take some things out, change some things a little, to keep focusing on my goal. All right, color. This is another same exact image, 3 different color situations, and they feel really different. You could argue this is winter, and maybe, you know, maybe it's a different time of day. Maybe this is the same day, 20 minutes apart, or maybe one spring, or so it just, you can choose as the artist. You don't have to be wed to your reference. And okay, that's all I'm going to show you. So color. Just like I like to do my composition, I'm going to work out what colors I want to use. And I don't do this before every single painting, but I have done this a lot. And so now I have these tools at my ready. This is something fun to do if you've never done it. You could do this with every red you have, with every blue you have, with every yellow you have. It's fun to let the paint just bleed together, just using water and gravity and letting the paints all run together. And you start to really see how many colors you can get with just 3. This is probably all of the colors I could need to get every painting. I can get a purple, a green, an orange, and all these tertiary neutrals in the middle. So I have pages and pages and pages where I've mixed colors, even mixing grays. And sometimes I get bored with those little spatches and swatches, so I'll do something a little more interesting to me. But this is labeled. I have the 2 colors I used, and then here I did it wet into wet, and here I did glazing. So I put one color down, let it dry, and then put the other on top. So you can see how different colors you can get even with just 2 colors, or sorry, different effects you can get even with just 2 colors. And I've done this with my blues and my reds and green after green after green. If you're a landscape painter, you know that it's very hard to find green in a tube that feels like the green we see out there. So I have mixed pages and pages and pages and pages of greens. So I'm not going to do that right now for you all just to save time, and I want to get to how I would start this actual painting. Well, I've already started the painting, but how I'm going to get to the playing part of we're still in the planning bucket. I'm going to get to the playing soon. This one in particular, because of all the sand and these dunes, there's some texture here. So again, I have lots of pages of this too, where I'm working out how to get texture. I have some sand, some salt, so I'm probably going to use some salt. I like to use salt and sand. Some resist. This is actually crayon. Going back to kindergarten, you know, you did the crayon resist with your kindergarten teacher and the watercolor on top. There's some dry brushing, some using a credit card to push down or lift out, splattering. If you've ever seen any of my art, I love to splatter. I splatter in almost every painting I have. And when I look at this image, I'm thinking of all the great splattering I'm going to get to do in that sand and some of those dune grasses. So figuring out how. So not only composition, the value, the colors, and then how. How are you going to approach this painting? And there's a sky here that's a pretty simple sky, but I've done pages and pages of this where I've worked out different skies too. And this is where these are working on washes, which if you've tried to do a wash in watercolor, it's one of the most difficult things ever to get a smooth wash like this. So again, worth your time to spend pages and pages. I have a fresh back I can paint on. That's like gold right there. But I discover things in doing this. And timing, and this is where I'm getting into the planning, right? This is where all this good planning becomes intuitive, and it becomes part of the process, but then I get to play with the paint. And this is when I'm playing with the paint and working out timing and colors. And when I'm speaking about timing, I'm talking about that left-hand side of this watercolor clock, where I'm talking about how wet is the paper and how much paint do I put on when, and all of that. And so not tonight, or maybe tonight, but I would love, I don't do this so prescriptively, but I would love for you all to try, what does butter and cream and milk and coffee and tea look like on dry paper and on damp paper and on moist paper and on wet paper. And you can play with all your colors. And I've had sheets of watercolor that almost become abstracts because I'm just playing and seeing what all these do together. And if you don't know what your watercolor is going to do, well, we never know exactly what watercolor is going to do. But there's a few things that it will always do. It will always dry. It will always dry lighter. So that's one thing. It will always follow water. So going back to this color wheel, you can just use clean water and drag these colors around, and the pools of the blue and the red and the yellow will mix because it will follow water, and it will follow gravity. And so those 3 things it will always do. Other than that, you can figure out a little more by practicing, but there's always some unpredictability. So why did I show this? Oh, this is why I wanted to show this to you. So here's another example of working out, I had the same image, horizontal and vertical. I just took pictures at different times. And then figuring out the composition. You can crop. I actually did a version where I cropped a little bit out of here. I'll show you in a second. This one I did. But one day I printed it out and another day I printed it out, and look at the very different printouts of these. And so when I'm talking about color and value and composition, if you're painting from photos, you have to have the caveat that you're painting from a photo. So sometimes I have people who say, I can't get that color. I can't get that color. And I say, but that's not actually that color either. I can't get that green. You have to sort of reverse engineer from a photo. And I actually love painting from these kind of junky printouts because it prevents me from zooming in. But then I have to be aware that the colors I'm using, and so this is the vertical one I did. And you can see my color choices are different from the photo because I was just, interpreting it, right? I'm indicating what's there. I'm not getting exactly, I don't have to be wed to that local color. And here's that horizontal one I did that I just showed you. So I just did this one the other day, and it's different. Again, the printout I have is different. So, okay. All the planning is done. I've drawn my image. This is the last stage of the painting. And this is important. I'm not a drawer, I'm a painter. I do not like to draw, I like to paint. However, in watercolor, I need to know where my lights are going to go. If I said I want some of that house to be white, I need to know exactly where I'm going to leave the white of that house. So that's exactly why I've done that. And now I can paint around it. I can put resist down. Today I'm going to paint around it. And then you notice this, I have this little strip here because this pad of paper I'm using is 10 by 14. And my reference image is 5 by 6, so that doesn't scale up at all. And it's going to be tricky if I try to draw this image on this piece of paper. And I'm thinking, well, wait, the house is supposed to be at the intersection of a third, but now the house is in the middle. What did I do wrong? And so just being really aware that your thumbnail, your reference image, and that your actual piece of art are all scaled to the same spot. So that is the planning. Now I'm going to get into the playing. Let me just check my time. Perfect. So we've been together about almost 30 minutes, and I haven't even touched a paintbrush except for a couple of minutes here. So this is what I'm talking about when I do all this great effort. The painting part can come pretty quickly. So I know my order of operations. I know that the very first thing I'm going to do is leave white. So I've done it already. Check. First step done. Now I'm going to go through this process, which is, I guess, arguably planning, but I'm mixing up my colors in that milky wash. And I only get a few seconds to work wet into wet. So if there's anything in here I want to work wet into wet, I need to have my colors ready to go because it takes me 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds to mix up a color, and that's too long sometimes. And you'll all discover in the room and where we're sitting how long things, but we're talking seconds, not minutes here. The other thing I want to think about, sorry, I'm almost going to paint. Actually, I'll paint and talk. I'm going to start with the sky and the water because the water's reflecting the sky. So I'm going to put that in. And even though that's not the lightest light, I want that to dry. And so sometimes I'll work an area of the painting knowing I need to get that down first so that I can paint another area. And in this case, I want to get the sky in because I want to then be able to put in the trees and that distant house. And I can't do that effectively if it's wet. And so this is when we're thinking about that the playing part here. It's playing, but it's also paying attention. So I want to get this sky in. And now I'm just using some clean water to add to that blue so that I can try to get a bit of that gradient. Sky is always lighter towards the horizon. So as it moves down, and I'm being really mindful about where that house has the white side on the house. And I'm going to put the water in right now too. And again, doing this now will give me a few seconds of drying time before I put the sand in. And all of these things are important to think about. So I want to go light to dark, but I also want to work in areas that are that I need to dry, so that then as I'm talking, as I'm mixing up my paint, as I'm thinking about the next step, that area can be drying. Okay, really quick, sky and water. So now I have a light side, part of my house is done and my sky and water is done. So this painting is just going like that. I work in this stage of the painting, big to small, light to dark, soft to hard. And what I mean by big to small is big shapes, big brushes. Light to dark, I try to start with my lighter areas first and move into my darker areas. And soft to hard, I'm thinking about edges. And so what I'm going to do now is, even though there's dunes in this grass, where's my image? Here we go. I'm going to paint the sand first. And I'm going to paint the lightest area of the sand. I'm going to try to get some good color there. This sand, I don't know if any of you have painted sand before, beaches. What color is sand? I don't know, beige. It could. So that's not fun for me to paint in watercolor. So I'm going to try to make it a little more interesting. And I'm also going to use a little bit about what I know of color theory, and that warm colors come closer to you. And so I'm going to play with that a little bit. And this is for my amusement, because if you enjoy doing the painting will be more enjoyable to look at. At least that's what I'm telling myself. I don't know if it's always true, but I think it's true. So I have raw sienna, rose madder, and a little bit of purple along with that cobalt blue. And I'm keeping them separate. These are these milky washes, but I'm getting it ready to go. And I'm going to start. I can always go darker, but I only get this one shot to really get some nice color down on my paper. So I'm not painting a dune. I'm not painting the house. I'm not painting people. I'm just sort of laying the foundation. And I have this new analogy that I keep using, and you all tell me if it makes sense to you or not. It makes a lot of sense to me. I think about a watercolor painting as a pizza. So you have your crust, and you have your sauce, and you have cheese, and then you have toppings. And so that's how I'm approaching this. Right now, I'm getting my crust. I'm putting down the foundation, all my lightest, the lightest colors. I'm trying to cover up any area that's not going to ultimately be white, because then every other decision I can make will be a more accurate value judgment. And I'm keeping my colors separate on my palette, but I'm mixing them together on my brush a little bit. And keeping in mind that watercolor dries lighter. So what I'm doing right now, and I'll show you in a second, and it might, those of you who can see what I'm doing might think that it looks a little crazy, but it's going to dry lighter. And once I put in some dune grasses, it'll be a little bit, hopefully neutralized, but this is what I think is fun to do. And so I'm adding a little bit warmer colors as I move closer. And I had mentioned I want to use sand, and I am, but not yet. That's like topping time for me in my pizza. So I'm still here just working on my crust. So here's my sand. Here's my foundation of my sand. And you can tell I've let the color mix, on the paper, right? So my palette is still sort of separate. They're starting to get mixed together, but I'm doing a lot of the mixing on my brush and then on the paper. And it's all one value, but different colors. Yes, thank you for pointing that out. Yes, I have it propped up on my tape, 1 inch. And again, I know that watercolor is going to follow gravity. If this were flat, that's just one more obstacle for myself. That's one other thing I don't know. Now I know that the watercolor is always going to come this way. A little bit, it can go slow, but it's always going to do that. And so this is just more, it helps me understand what's going on, control it a little bit more. Okay, there's some distant land back there and some rocks. This is dry enough here. I'm just going to throw something in there. When I say throw something in there, I'm just grabbing some color from my palette, because it's really white sand beaches back there, but I don't want to leave that area white. So I'm just throwing in some general rock color. I've stuck with the same brush this whole time, but I'm about to have to switch. Now, I'm not sure during this session, the next 10 minutes, I'm going to finish this painting completely because of drying time. And when I'm talking about edges, I want to have be able to get some hard edges. and I cannot get any hard edges, meaning the house, distinct shapes of these people, even maybe some more precise shapes on the dunes. I can't get that while this is wet. And I have a hairdryer here, but I don't I think the timing is going to work out that I'll just be able to pause. So I'm just throwing in the next value. So I'm working light to dark. So I have put that distant land in. I'm testing this. Yep, this is dry enough. I can starting to get the house and the trees in. And I said I was working light to dark. So if you think about, where's my value study? I print my value study and my value, yeah. So my value study, or just for your sake to show you this. So I have the sky, I have the water, I have the grass, I have the distant land, I have the white part of the house. So what I have left to paint are the greens back there, the dark area of the house, and the dunes. And there's a couple people back there, but those are details. And so the people are going to be like right before I sign my name. I mean, that's the topping. That's like the oregano. I mean, that's not even top. That's the Parmesan cheese at the end, right? On my pizza here. So what I have is crust. I'm going to start to add now the sauce. And so I know that I'm at that stage because I have just a little bit of white left. So once I get to that area, I like to compare values to what they're going to be ultimately. So for me to now go in to do these dunes would be fine because I have all the grasses down, but it's still a little damp, so I want to soften that. But for me to try to put in the house right here without having the trees doesn't make any sense because I'm not going to be able to judge the value accurately against the white paper and vice versa. So I'm actually going to paint the trees, and if you look at this, you can see that the trees in the house are all the same value. They're different colors, but they're all the same value. So that's where I'm headed next. And again, this knowing my values is helpful for guiding me on what I'm going to do next. And because I've spent so many of those pages and pages and pages mixing up greens, I can very quickly, I don't have to spend other pages right now mixing up greens. I know what colors on my palette are going to make which greens, so I can get those colors out and start painting. I'm going to try to finish my, I'm just going to try to get to the cheese stage at least on this watercolor pizza before we stop and I give you guys time to paint. So questions as I'm mixing these colors up. I've been talking nonstop. Do you have questions about what I've been doing up until now? Yes, Madeline.
The color studies that you do, how often are you referencing those while you play?
Do you mean this, like the swatches of all the color mixing and all of that?
Yeah.
Truthfully, never. Because what happens when I do that is, well, I don't reference them as I'm doing a painting and I say, I want to get that color, I'm trying to do it. But I do those often. Those are not things I did 10 years ago and I just now pull out. I do those all the time. Anytime I get a new color, I do it. Or if I'm don't know what to paint, but I want to be painting, or I'm waiting for something to dry, I'll play around with that color mixing. So it becomes part of it just becomes like part of what I know. And I discover a lot by doing that too. And I've told this example before, but I was mixing around with greens, newer to watercolor, and I had ultramarine blue, and I mixed it with my Winsor yellow, which is a bright yellow. And if you know, ultramarine blue does not make very nice greens. It has too much red in it, and red and green are complements, so that just neutralizes, so it becomes gray. And I was like, oh, that's not a nice green at all. That's not what I was going for. However, I said, but you know what? That looks like lavender. That looks like the green of lavender. It looks like an olive tree. And so, sure enough, I found myself with the opportunity to paint an olive grove. And I said, I know exactly how I'm going to paint that green, which looks gray. But I said, I already know, because I discovered it along the way. So those types of things happen. And what I've done now, and I'll just show you, I have two blues and 2 yellows. And I know what those are going to do together, but I'm also, I don't want to paint this. These are not even trees. I don't even know what they are. This is why it's really helpful to have a non-digital image for me. Because if I had this question, what is that? I would zoom in and then I'd get too much information. And then I try to paint that information. And then all of a sudden I've lost the forest through the trees. And this is no longer a painting about an S curve of value. And it becomes a painting about this funny little distant, bush that I've discovered back there. And that's not what I want. So I've already discovered I have the wrong brush. And the reason I know I have the wrong brush is because I'm getting too light of a value in an area I want a darker value, meaning my brush was holding too much water, and so it just kept getting light. I couldn't get dark. So that's often true too, and I find that all the time, that sometimes people can't get the value they want. They say, I just can't get it dark enough. And it can be as simple as just switching your brush. Because your brush is holding too much water, you can't get the right value you're looking for.
So what colors are you using to make your green?
So I'm using 5 different colors to make all of these greens because I want the transition. So I'm using Windsor yellow and raw sienna and Prussian blue and cobalt blue. And they're starting to just mix across the paper. Do you see that bead that's forming just by me holding it up vertically, right? That. If that's something you want in your painting, then you can paint vertically, but you have to be really mindful to see the drip starting. So that's why, for me, this works just fine. The other thing is I usually paint standing up, and I know that eventually my back will not allow me to do what I'm doing currently. But while I can still bend over and paint, I really like to do it because it makes me step back. So I go like this, and then I go like this. And all of a sudden, I've changed how I'm looking at my painting. And I'm going to tell you today to please take a break. And I always say I'm not trying to be nice. It's an essential part of the painting process. You have to step away from your artwork, walk around the room, go get a, I guess people don't smoke anymore, but, go get a cup of coffee or walk outside, look at what other people are doing, because then you can come back and see your artwork a lot more clearly. All right, let's get some dunes in here. I only have a few more minutes of your time before moving on. And this is dry enough. So it's still buckled a little bit. And if you've been painting watercolor a long time, you know that when when it's really, really dry, it will be flat. And if it's still buckled, then it's not quite dry. And so thinking about that watercolor clock, I'm in the sort of the damp area here, but I can get hard enough edges to start finding the shapes. And remember, I'm going back to now, what was it about this painting that I liked? It was this S curve leading the eye through. So that's what I'm starting to do. And I'm still at this stage, big to small, light to dark, soft to hard. So I've switched down to a smaller brush. I'm starting to make that transition. I'm definitely in the sauce on my pizza now. And but I'm holding this brush really far back. So at the end of the painting, right when I put those people in, when I sign my name, I'm going to have my tiny brush and I'm going to be like this. But that's to the end of the painting. And I know that a lot of people in watercolor, it's frustrating because you want to paint the fun stuff. The fun stuff is the dunes and the people and all those details. Well, I think this is the fun stuff too, but that's sometimes what gets you into the painting. And it's frustrating to have to sort of work the pizza method, I guess. If you have an area that's all cheese and all the toppings and another area that only has crust and no sauce or anything, that's not going to be a very tasty pizza. Sorry for the analogy. I love analogies, and this one is stuck in my brain lately. So it just really speaks to the way I think about watercolor, which is adding up, adding and adding and adding and adding. And I know a couple more brush strokes, and then I'll turn this around so you can see where I'm headed. A lot of these dune grass are details. I'm not into the details yet. I'm still starting to, oh, you know what I forgot to do? Well, here, just starting to get these shapes. And I've drawn a few of them. I just paint right over my pencil. I never erase my pencil marks. I don't mind if I see them or not. I forgot to do that house. I was going to do that at the same time as the trees. So I'm going to go back and do that. But I want it, watercolor is drying lighter. So everything I'm doing right now, even though I'm starting to get darker values, I'm still, everything is still changeable. If I decide, ooh, that dune's in the wrong spot, it's not beyond repair. I wouldn't lift it out, but I can move it. Once you get in that thick, dark paint, that's when it becomes a little bit harder to change and move things around. So let me do this house back there. Any other questions about this process? about thinking about planning and then playing, composition, value, color, texture, getting the drawing down. Yeah, go ahead. Come here. Yeah.
Do you ever sort of paint yourself into a corner, sort of feel like challenged by certain things? How do you kind of deal with those challenges?
Well, I'll tell you that when I first started doing watercolor painting, I would often do the same painting like 3 or 4 times because I was not spending time planning. I just jumped into the painting, which I had always done as an oil painter. And so I was often finding myself painted into a corner or something. But this approach allows, I'm not happy with every painting I ever do. But I can usually find a little 2x2 corner to use as a gift card, or use the back of it for something else. I think a lot of artists would say if you ever buy their painting, I'm definitely included in this. You get a 2-for-1 because there's most likely something on the back of the painting. At least watercolor artists will say that. But there's ways to get yourself out of trouble. You can lift, you can, do a few other things. Usually when I'm in that situation is when I stop painting. And I would find that almost all of the situations where I've gotten stuck, it's when I have kept painting. And when I have kept painting, when I should have stopped.
Interesting.
Especially in watercolor because of this timing issue. If I'm ready to go and I want to add in, I want to start to change, say I want to start to bring some of these dune grasses up. It's not time yet because this is still buckled and I won't be able to get a straight hard edge. I'm going to get an edge that puffs a little and it's not going to look like a dune grass. So those types of impatience, when I'm impatient with the process, and actually I will often have 2 paintings going at one time so that I can keep going. Because it is hard to take a break, especially if you're like already right now, I need to stop. So you got paint, but I don't want to stop.
What colors are you using for the house?
Oh, that's a good question. So right at this stage of painting, I'm just using whatever I have on my palette. So these colors started off all separate and now I'm just using my brush. I'm not mixing. I almost never mix a color on my palette. So I don't usually take a blue and a yellow and mix up a big green on my palette. I don't know if I've ever done anything like that. I will take blue and blue and yellow, and I will mix them on the paper or mix them on my brush. And so what I'm doing right now, I'm trying to get a neutral for that house back there. So I'm just sort of grabbing a little bit of some things and I'm toning it down with some of this brown. So that's what I have on my brush. The other thing, I didn't mention this before, but it's really helpful to have a scratched piece of paper. So then you can test your colors. That's way too green. So, but that's better, but that's a little too dark. So that's sort of the color, and that's just a mix of stuff I have on here.
Being this close to your picture,
Yeah.
I was so, looking at it, and I just knew this is a vegetation and this is the house.
Yeah.
And then you said they were both the same value.
Yeah.
I said, wow, because they're 2 different colors. I'm thinking,
Yeah.
how can they be the same value? And then I squinted.
Squinting, the old-fashioned way of artists.
And it
yes.
really, it brought it totally.
We have so much technology now, and we can argue about the benefits and hazards of that forever. But that I can just get this. I can get this value study in 1 minute on my phone by turning it over. I don't have to squint quite as much. But this is the way. That's how you do it. Okay. All right. Let me stop because I want to get you all painting and have you all go through this process, and I'll come around and. Oops, that's okay. I'll come around and talk to everybody. And again, I'm finding like I want to start to put in some shadows over here. Anyway, I'm going to stop right there. I will tell you that I have my crust. I have my sauce. I don't have the cheese everywhere, bless you. I have some cheese back here, but these dunes still need a lot of cheese, and there's no toppings on this painting yet. So I really have the details to come, but I have big to small. I've spent 50 minutes chatting with you all. I would say 30 of those was the planning and 20 of those was the playing. And so I don't have a ton more to do. I have more to do. And this is where watercolor, I think people get frustrated. They're like, my painting's not good. My painting's not good. Yet. It's just not good yet. You're building this foundation. The pizza doesn't taste great, well, unless you like, bakery pizza. But, it tastes better when it's got pepperoni and mushrooms and cheese and all that than it does if it's just the sauce. So be patient with yourself. This is not a finished painting. I'm going to stop right now, but it's not finished. And so just keeping that in mind. Okay. Any questions? I will come around and talk to everybody, help you think through some of your choices. If you already know exactly what you want to paint, I would still encourage you to perhaps challenge yourself to do 1 or 2 thumbnails. Maybe try your image vertically or horizontally. If you're determined it's going to be one, just try it the other way. Try a little value study. If you've never done any of the color mixing, especially with your greens or oranges, anything, again, I use the fronts and backs of everything. If you only have one piece of paper today, I have a piece of paper you can borrow and you can play, because I do want you to do some planning, thinking a little bit. Even if you already know what you want to do, sometimes reverse engineering it will open something and get a fresh idea for you. Okay? Thanks, everybody. I'll work my way around the room.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.